Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Nadine, the supervising librarian of the Philip Roth Personal Library at the Newark Public Library. We are so very pleased to have Amy Pozorski join us today for a dialogue about American pastoral. Amy Pozorski is a professor of English at Central State Connecticut University and served as president of the Philip Roth Society from 2009 to 2015 and is currently co-executive editor of Philip Roth Studies. For security reasons, we're running this book discussion in a Zoom webinar format. So this means that while you won't be able to see each other at any time, do feel free to post any comments or questions in the Q&A or in the chat box. If you're using the chat feature, please do send your message to all participants so that everybody can see your comments. And then for part of this discussion, I will unmute participants if they wish to share their favorite passage of the book or if they have a question. So we will begin with Amy Pozorski, then participants can share their favorite passage, and if there's time, we'll open it up to a Q&A. Please be aware that this is being recorded and streamed on the Newark Public Library's Facebook page. Amy, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Nadine, for that nice introduction. I was telling Nadine when I logged in today that I'm actually calling in from CCSU, my academic office. And I came here, number one, because it's air conditioned, and number two, because I remembered that I had this drawing of Philip Roth that my student Liz Willett drew for me. And I thought it'd be so cool to have him behind me. I didn't figure out how to set it up, but he'll be sitting beside us during today's discussion. It's so nice to see you all. So I would like to begin today by thanking Nadine for organizing this wonderful series, for her kind introduction. Thank you to everybody working behind the scenes and to Rosemary Steinbaum and the Board of Trustees of the Newark Public Library. If you have not yet visited the Philip Roth Personal Library, you are in for an enormous treat. Thank you to Ira Nadell, Jim Bloom, Matthew Shipe, who were predecessors in this series. You are all hard acts to follow. So I have about 20 minutes of comments. I'll kind of pepper my remarks with some passages. I'll refer to them and we can go back to them to closely read if you're interested. But again, I imagine that you have your own ways into this book. You have your own favorite passages. And so if there's time, and I'm sure there will be time, we can talk about those passages and then we can have discussion and Q&A. So I think we are well familiar with the phrase that a classic novel like American Pastoral, quote unquote, stands the test of time. And when readers and scholars say that, they generally mean that it will be read for a long time to come, across years and decades, and we assume with Roth, even centuries. But as a close reader and literary scholar, I have come to think about that phrase, about what it means to stand the test of time, in terms of the amount of time a single reader spends with a single book. I chose as my focus for today Roth's 1997 American Pastoral. I was doing the math. I think that means that this book has been with me for 25 years because I have spent so much time with it. Because if I were to measure a book's greatness by the amount of time I can spend with a novel and still to this day find something new, then it is a great book indeed. This also means, of course, that the novel is open to all kinds of interpretations from the imaginations of people from all across the globe. And depending on when we read the book and where we are in geography, we will see each nuance a little bit differently. Roth is not pedantic like many social critics. He is not on a high horse or a hobby horse telling us all what to think. He is a deeply resonant writer whose works stand up to close reading. And in that way, I would argue they stand the test of time. So I wanted to spend much of our time today, speaking of time, looking at passages from the novel that are close to your heart, to read them aloud, for they must be heard. They will bring Roth alive to us once again, and to spend a great deal of time reflecting on the sentences themselves, the images, the sounds, the punctuation, the denotation, the connotation, the symbols, references, even insults and barbs. But before we do that, I would like to tell the story of my own time with American Pastoral, in part to get the conversation going. I wanted to share with you the ways I see the novel meaning, depending on where I am in time and with whom I have just met, and even the historical forces moving around us. Many people like to say that Roth's work is uncanny, so familiar in its ability to predict the future. But actually, since we all know fiction cannot predict the future, we might say that Roth was very, very good at reading history, the signs of the times, and the patterns that continue to work in our national and local fabrics today. The book I hold in my hand, this is the book, first edition, all my sticky notes, is the Houghton Mifflin hardback from 1997. Like every dedicated Roth reader, I bought it as soon as it came out. I had just finished my MA at Marquette University in Milwaukee and moved back to my hometown of Green Bay, Wisconsin, where I was renting an upstairs unit in a tri-family home, a once great Victorian in downtown Green Bay that had since been carved into rental units. I was born in such a home in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Both of these transitional homes resembled Roth's childhood home on Summit Avenue in Newark. I read the novel the first time outside with a focus on Zuckerman's voice, the familiar narrative voice of the first Zuckerman trilogy from the late 1970s to early 80s, now returned for a second time to walk us through the high or low, depending on whom you ask, points in American history. You see, I wanted to be a writer, not a literary scholar. It wasn't until later I discovered you could do both. And so I felt very close to Zuckerman's self-reflective moments about writing another's story. You get people wrong, he says, and then you get them wrong again. That's on page 35. We can go to that if you're interested. As someone who lies awake at night thinking about all the ways I have gotten people wrong throughout the day, I completely empathize with this take. To be alive is to get it wrong. By the time I returned a few years later to the novel, I was very interested in the history of Vietnam, about what it means to bring the war home to a president who has also gotten it wrong. My questions about US foreign policy only intensified after the 9/11 terrorist attack and the war on terror and the falsely promised weapons of mass destruction leading us into war with Iraq. I am sorry to admit to so many people I have never met before, to empathize with Mary, the daughter of the Swede with a stutter who grew up in the shadow of her beauty queen mother, the girl who bucked against her father's values of capitalism and manifest destiny, the Johnny Appleseed myth and all of that. That's on page 316, 2 pages on Johnny Appleseed. How many of us have found ourselves, like Mary, incredibly angry at this country, at our fathers and our forefathers, some of the time? My first article for Philip Roth Studies, American Pastoral and the Traumatic Ideals of Democracy, ultimately became the seed for my first book. I didn't realize that I put that pun in there after Johnny Appleseed until now, grown, I'm sorry. I was interested in looking at the references to the founding fathers, how Bill Orcutt is a descendant of the revolutionaries, 5 pages, 302 to 307, about how his quote unquote family goes back to the revolution. And in that work, I argued that American Pastoral is not about the traumatic history of Vietnam War after all, but about the traumatic history of the Revolutionary War, about how this novel tells us America's birth as a nation was traumatic in the sense that we were not prepared for all we were promised: freedom, liberty, happiness. In this reading, the novel is an allegory about the immigrants who pull themselves up by their bootstraps. We've heard that narrative before, maybe in the form of Swede, and the quote unquote founders of our country, embodied by Orcutt, mostly at odds if we think about how both men are fighting for Don's attention. Surely Don is an allegorical name. That Mr. Orcutt, the architect, quote unquote, Mr. America, has stolen Don from the Swede while shucking corn in his very own home should tell us something. From there, moving on for a while visiting France for a conference, I became very dedicated to the idea that the novel is about a house divided, in light especially going back to Lincoln's argument during the Civil War that a quote unquote house divided cannot stand. There are so many references to building a house, designing a house, renovating a house, that I also came to see this as an important argument about Americanness. A house that became divided when the Tea Party took control of Congress during the midterm elections in 2002, for example, when I was pregnant with my son. If we are thinking about the significance of places in my reading, then I could circle back to Italy, where my good friend Pia Masiero, who reads narratologically, who thinks about how a novel is structured as a narrative, says, isn't that interesting? How Zuckerman completely drops out of the novel on page 89 with the words as he imagines it. This has us thinking that everything that comes after is Zuckerman's invented story about the Swede, with us knowing now, because of his previous self-referential point about getting people wrong, that this is not the true story of the Swede after all, but Zuckerman's fantasy about his life in the wake of his daughter's bombing. That incestuous kiss me like you kiss mother moment is not in fact true. It is Zuckerman's imposition, his trying to make sense of a family and the downfall of a man he worshipped as a child. Another reading that really influenced me comes from Claudia Roth-Pierpont, who was the first to point out to me that moment when Mary catalogs the flowers around Rimrock actually appears twice in the novel, almost verbatim, she says, and has us wondering if that is an accident or an important repetition involving trauma. As someone who loves flowers and gardening, that long moment on pages 418 to 419, that's the second time it's mentioned, is so wonderful to me. I could spend hours speaking of the test of time on those sentences alone. The catalog of the wildflowers in the midst of an epiphany. 3 + 1 is 4. The daughter has made her father to see. That's 418. This too is Zuckerman's fantasy of the Swede's fantasy during the final dinner scene of the novel. Structured like a true pastoral, which traditionally ends with a feast, even with the mention of sheep. A visitor, I forgot who, I went to look this up, is starting to talk about sheep she saw on like a recent trip. The dinner party, narrated over 100 pages or more, is less the final celebration offering bounty and closure, and more a testament to the American berserk embodied by the Lovov family. While the Swede is terrified Mary will walk through the door during dinner, Jesse Orcutt renders another horror, stabbing Lou and just missing his eye. Of course, we can't help but see this as a moment straight out of Oedipus, with the blinding of the king revealing an important insight, although we are never quite sure of the insight gained here, if at all. I will end with two final examples of new readings, tested with time and patience and via history. And then I think we should move on to discuss your passages, or we could go back to some of the passages I only mentioned in passing here. The first catches me up to my new work in 2022. And the second goes all the way back to the first time I ever taught this novel, a strategy that I have used every year since. But first, my more recent interest. In 2020, in the wake of George Floyd's death and the pandemic, with calls of racial injustice, being also a pandemic, and Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality reaching the mainstream, her work worrying about how Black women are caught and therefore overlooked in the intersection of racial justice issues, often misremembered as being led by Black men on the one hand, and feminist issues, often misremembered as being led by white women on the other hand, I started thinking about the significance of Angela Davis in this novel. I think if I were reading this in 1997 with deep empathy for the Swede, I am a granddaughter of immigrants who've worked really hard to build what they have, I might see Davis as a kind of mocking antagonist. Today, however, I'm newly interested in Davis's radical teachings and, significantly for this conversation, Roth's own empathy for Davis and for the disenfranchised Black workers of Newark leather made that she speaks for. In the last 2 years, Jack Berliner Blau published a work with University of Virginia Press called The Philip Roth We Don't Know. And while he is a friend, I think he also understands that I disagree with his readings of Roth's unflattering representations of women and people of color. I think, in fact, that when Roth made characters like Jerry Lvov speak, he is criticizing their sentiments rather than endorsing them. I spent much of this summer looking at that scene when Zuckerman imagines the Swede imagining Angela Davis visiting him at his dinner table. It is in the part called The Fall. It is 10 pages long. The signal phrase is 5 years past. That's on page 157. A conversation between Angela Davis and the Swede, as Zuckerman imagines it, trying to empathize with a man whose daughter has murdered 4 people by protesting the Vietnam War. Angela Davis is about Rita Cohen's age. She's being tried in San Francisco. The Swede thinks her hair reminds him of Rita Cohen. Another line, at the kitchen table one night, Angela Davis appears to the Swede as Our Lady of Fatima did to those children in Portugal, as the Blessed Virgin did down in Cape May. That's page 160. It's compared to a religious experience. Instead of the Blessed Virgin, quote unquote, Angela Davis, a Black feminist radical appears, and she schools the Swede. Here is a line from her. What she did, or about her, what she did was criminal only in as much as it is defined as criminal by a state that is itself criminal and will commit ruthless aggression anywhere in the world to preserve the unequal distribution of wealth and the oppressive institutions of class domination, unquote. That sounds like it comes right straight from Marxist ideology. Again, reading in the late 1990s, I'm thinking, Roth is having his fun with Angela Davis. And now in 2022, I'm thinking, are we to revisit Davis's thinking in the 21st century? So Roth does not give us easy answers. Coupled with the stories Roth tells for a web of stories about his early experiences with the civil rights movement, I think we can revisit this 1997 scene in light of the 21st century to reconsider the significance of moments like this in the book. And finally, in the end, I want to return to the beginning, the first 2 pages of the entire novel, these pages that set the scene for everyone, explaining the significance of the Swedes' quote unquote Viking good looks in the wake of anti-Semitism in World War II, during World War II and beyond and before. I have been known to spend well over 45 minutes with students closely reading these 2 pages alone, thinking I was special until my son now, the one I was pregnant with in 2002 and despairing about the direction of the country. He is now a fully grown computer scientist who reported 2 years ago on his experience with his very first college level literature course, quote, in the fashion of all English courses, he said, we spent the entire first day on the first page of a 400-page novel. We do not have to do that today with our remaining time together. What I hope I have done is given us some things to think about And I would also like to hear your thoughts. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. So here we go. Here's an open forum. Please feel free to post any questions or comments in the chat. And we're also going to be looking for volunteers if you want to read your favorite passage. So please raise your hand and I'll unmute you, and then you could share with all of us.
If there isn't anyone right away, I can give an example. Oh, but Ira has one. So we'll let Ira take the baton.
Well, fantastic. Can you hear me? Yes?
Ira.
Oh, fantastic. All the way from Vancouver. Can you believe it? A wonderful engaged presentation. And what I particularly like is the personal dimension about your own reading of the book and your own teaching of the book. So I'll start with a very general question. Do you think this book is too dated and it will not continue to have its prominence in the classroom, where as a teaching text, it's critical. But for general readers, it's going to seem like the past and in a way, a dated historical novel. And perhaps the real way to read this book is, and you suggest this, as a historical novel, not as an experiment in narrative or a representation of Roth's concepts of self and all these other matters that we raise. Is it fundamentally a historical novel? And if so, will it become dated as many historical novels are?
Thanks, Ira, firstly for being here where it is. What time is it for you? 10:30. It's still Saturday morning where you are. And thank you for thank you for your nice remarks. I mean, I said that I disagreed with Jacques' approach early on. He came to my class, as you did. We did an all online Roth seminar, I think in the spring of 2020 or 2021. And when he appeared, he asked students what they thought, understanding that many of our students now, 25 years later, are anti-capitalist. They're interested in robust, sympathetic, understanding representations of women. They're interested in representations of work and workers. And racial difference. And so I feel like while the words in the novel will remain the same, the ways that we approach it teaching can be quite different. We can look at representations of Angela Davis. We can look at representations of Mary. I think in 1997, I would have read her as the bad guy. Like, why is she resisting her father's success story so much? But if you kind of think about our students in 2022 who are frustrated with the leadership in this country, who are frustrated with how capitalism has worked for their generation, I think that opens up a new perspective. The meanings seem to change based on, or our understanding seem to change based on different generations' experiences in time, I would argue. Is that fair? In other words, that's a way to say, I don't want to throw this book away because it's amazing, right? Like the writing at the level of the writing seems like it will guarantee the fact that it exists.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Sure.
And for those of you that don't know, Ira Nadel wrote Philip Roth, A Counter Life, and I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. Okay, thank you, Ira.
Thank you, Ira.
Thank you.
We have a comment from Jim. Speaking of getting people wrong, the current New York Review of Books has an illuminating essay covering how egregiously everyone who weighed in kept getting Davis wrong.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Jim. And you know what? Is this Jim Bloom?
I believe so.
I'm now starting to wonder if I'm thinking so much about Davis because of Jim Bloom's own work and
Oh, let me allow Jim to speak. 1 second.
okay.
Go ahead, Jim.
I just wanted to say, yes, it is Jim Bloom. But I was wondering about things that do make it very relevant. And I'm thinking some minor characters. You were talking about Bill Orcutt. And I mean, I just wrote about sports and Roth. And of course, Bill Orcutt, has to be taken down very literally by the Swede. And I think that's part of Swede's conquest of America, because Bill Orcutt is Mr. America, comes from a colonial family. He has all the right pedigree. I'm also, reverberating with the passage on page 35 that we all love about getting people wrong. Jerry, the surgeon Swede's little brother, is described as someone who's always had to be right, who was always right, not even had to be right. I think I'm quoting here. And of course, the funniest passage, or one of the funniest passages in what's otherwise a grim, serious novel about revolution and violence, is what Jerry does with, I even forget what the animal is, the squirrel pelts, right, to make the coat for his girlfriend that stinks up the house. And of course, he becomes a surgeon. So you wonder, if he gets things wrong as a surgeon, because he's described as someone who's never wrong and commands the operating room and is a bit of a bully. So in some ways we have two kind of violators or transgressors who challenge Swede, both his brother and Bill Orcutt. And I'm just wondering, if you want to think about the relationship between some of those minor characters, the kind of constellation of different voices that Swede has to contend with, and that Roth loves to impersonate. And I think as long as Roth is doing his impersonations at the top of his game, he's always worth reading.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe I'm getting too much fun into the conversation.
I love that, Jim. What you've done is really helped me think about this as a novel about novels, or a novel that's interested, that has Zuckerman talk about getting people wrong as a way of reflecting on the minor characters that get people wrong, as you've said, as a way of reflecting how in my reading, I hope this isn't going too far, I'm like a child of hippies, I've said before, as a way of reflecting how institutions get people wrong, right? Like, do we have to succumb to the teachings of the big institutions if they themselves are fallible? And so that's another reason why, to Ira's point, I would say this novel is always relevant. What do people do? Roth is the best at defying institutions, at kind of questioning the status quo. So we do have on that page 35, it's Zuckerman talking about the writing process, about getting people wrong, but it's also reflecting on other characters in the novel who get people wrong. It maybe reflects, back to your original comment, on how we've got Angela Davis wrong, and all the other institutions that we're told to believe and trust in. The doctors, for example. Should I read the passage, or does somebody want to read that on page 35? You fight your superficiality. Jim or others, or I can?
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to sort of follow. Well, I thank the chat for telling me it was a hamster, so I was wrong about squirrels. So, but you really can't talk about institutions, I think, in terms of Roth. I mean, this is what I just did for the past 2 years. But you can't talk about institutions in Roth's work without talking about the military. And, that Swede's eagerness to fight the Japanese, and then his disappointment at ending up, teaching volleyball and softball at Paris Island, is sort of one example about how institutional life kind of saves his life, but gets his life wrong according to his own narrative. And then, of course, the other institution is the glove factory.
Mhm.
And of course that goes wrong because of the deterioration, the urban deterioration, and I shouldn't say this at the Newark Library, but the urban deterioration in Newark um, in the 50s and 60s, which was the product. Again, I'm going back to my own work of 50 years of corrupt city government, another institution that intersects or is laced into Ross' rhetorical agenda in the novel. So pick your institution, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another thing. I didn't know if I should layer on that. I start my latest chapter with an anecdote about visiting Rosemary Steinbaum's home when I was doing research in the Newark Public Library. And she is so charming and trying to make conversation, and said, I think, Jim, you probably heard this before. What do you hope to see while you're visiting Newark? And I said, I'm here to see gentrification. And of course, that didn't come out right. That is not what I was hoping to see at all. I was not prepared to engage with human company after 2 years in lockdown. But I really am interested in how Roth represents in American Pastoral and also The Human Stain. What happens when upper middle class white people are able to leave, what happens after the riots of 1967, and how Newark is able or not able to bounce back. So that's in this novel as well. I completely agree. We remember Coleman, is it Coleman Silk? We remember the conversation in The Human Stain about what it means not to have left Newark. And I think that comes up here in American Pastoral as well. Back to the war, there is war imagery in this passage on page 335 about getting people wrong, right? You might as well have the brain of a tank, for example. And what is that doing here? All of this rhetoric about kind of violence and imposition, I think, is interesting.
Thank you, Jim. Anyone else?
Could we look at the passage then? Is it all right if I read it? Does everyone
Sure,
have
thank you.
books? Okay, so we're on page 35. This is Zuckerman telling us about the process of writing about the Swede. I'm at the very top of 35. You fight your superficiality, your shallowness, so as to try to come at people without unreal expectations, without an overload of bias or hope or arrogance, as untank-like as you can be, sans cannon and machine guns and steel plating half a foot thick. You come at them unmenacingly on your own 10 toes, instead of tearing up the turf with your caterpillar treads. Take them on with an open mind as equals, man to man, as we used to say, and yet you never fail to get them wrong. You might as well have the brain of a tank. You get them wrong before you meet them, while you're anticipating meeting them. You get them wrong while you're with them, and then you go home and tell somebody else about the meeting, and you get them all wrong again. Since the same generally goes for them with you, the whole thing is really a dazzling illusion of all perception, an astonishing farce of misperception. And yet, what are we to do about this terribly significant business of other people, which gets bled of the significance we think it has and takes on instead a significance that is ludicrous? So ill-equipped are we all to envision one another's interior workings and invisible aims. Is everyone to go off and lock the door and sit secluded like the lonely writers do in a soundproof cell, summoning people out of words and then proposing that these word people are closer to the real thing than the real people that we mangle with our ignorance every day? The fact remains that getting people right is not what living is all about anyway. It's getting them wrong that is living, getting them wrong and wrong and wrong, and then on careful reconsideration, getting them wrong again. That's how we know we're alive. We're wrong. Maybe the best thing would be to forget about being right or wrong about people and just go along for the ride. But if you can do that, well, lucky you. I think that we all, I mean, we cannot deny the fact that the repetition of the word wrong here is on purpose. It's not like Roth couldn't figure out another way to say wrong. It's like, I don't know if you've ever counted how many there are. It's like, it's right there in your face. And yet, Zuckerman says that is what it means to be alive. But as Jim was talking, and probably I should defer to him since he just wrote Roth's Wars, all those 8 opening lines compare the process of writing and the writing tools to war tools, unless you read Tanks another way. But I'm thinking about on tank-like as you can be, you try, right? Cannon, machine guns, steel plating half a foot thick, caterpillar treads, tearing up turf. You have the brain of a tank. I mean, that is curious to me. He could have used any kind of metaphor or analogy for the process of writing, of trying not to impose your own understanding of things and on values on people. And he uses the language of war machinery to do it, which is striking.
Thank you very much. Please don't be shy. I see some familiar people here. I recognize some of our visitors and some of our friends. Please do raise your hand anytime, comment or question, or if you just want to read from the book. Okay, here we go. Jim?
Yeah, I was also thinking about that in relation to pausing to speak here, to Mary's stuttering, because, you know, like a lot of parents, you know, Dawn and Swede and the therapist, you know, are all trying to make what came out wrong right. And one of the only times that Mary didn't stutter was when Swede was going through the Marine marching chants with her.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, I forget the exact chant it was, but it was like hit the deck, up 2, 3, 4, and that kind of, you know, military training routine. So I was just wondering if, you know, not just Mary's radicalism, but Mary's backstory, you know, should figure into what you were saying about Mary before, and
Yes.
Angela Davis. And just coincidentally, as I put in the chat, I just recently read this article that was pretty much focused on how, you know, everyone, including, you know, journalists and her enemies and even her allies, kept getting Angela Davis wrong and underestimating her and misrepresenting her politics and kind of minimizing her feminism. And
Yeah, I mean, it's significant to me. I haven't seen a lot of work on Ross representations of Black women, particularly Angela Davis, who is like so significant, right? Or even the mother in Silk's mother and sister in The Human Stain.
Yeah.
What was I going to say about that? Oh, the stutter. I mean, so as you may be able to tell based on the way I describe my relationship with the book, I read through a trauma lens through and through. And so that comes out of an engagement with psychoanalysis. And what psychoanalysis says is whenever a patient lying on the couch during therapy starts failing and trying to tell the truth about something or recall an event, if there's a stutter or a stammer or a silence or a repetition or just this kind of stonewalling, that is when we have to focus. That's the tell. That's the sign that something is wrong. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about Mary's stutter. I mean, just at the literal level, it's the thing that makes her imperfect in the eyes of her mother. But it also is trying, there's this paradox, right? It's trying to speak to something that nobody is paying attention to, whether it be frustration or socialization or I don't know, both of those are just like her problem with her sense of how history is working at this moment in time. So I love that idea, Jim, of looking at Mary's stutter more carefully.
Is this your favorite book?
Is it mine? I think it's the most challenging for me. So at the level of just like sheer pleasure, I would say no, but at the level of intellectual challenge, yes. Sheer pleasure, ooh, that's a hard one.
What was the first one you read?
The first one I read was The Ghostwriter. So that was my introduction to Nathan Zuckerman, the writer. I don't know if there are any other writers in here, but I'm like, yes, I read Nathan Zuckerman talking about writing and think he's talking about me. And so that has a really solid place in my heart also. And the imagining, right? In The Ghostwriter, he imagines that Anne Frank has survived and is sleeping with his mentor. So the imagination here too, what happens if Mary does come back? What if Angela Davis does appear?
So Roth taught master classes, and I was listening to one of them. We found some cassette tapes and VHS tapes, and some of the classes are recorded on them. And Roth was saying how back when he was teaching at Princeton, he came up with this character of Mary and typed up a few pages, and for years and years just wasn't getting anywhere with it, carried these pages around with him. And then he realized, oh, the Swede, he'll focus on the fa, and then everything just came together.
That's really useful to think about, just in terms of what Ira was saying about this as an historical novel, one that looks back to Vietnam, to Roth's kind of stories about how he has this idea but does not know how to start it. Like, how do you tell this history in the form of a novel? Maybe you start with the Swede who has everything, right, and needs to be that's very slanted language, who comes to understand his role in history through his daughter's violence. I think it's really fascinating, and that it took Roth, as you said, so long to find his way into this story. Ira.
Oh, there you go. Oh, and then we've got Carolyn too. So Ira and then Carolyn. Go ahead, Ira. You're muted. Oh, okay. Let me go to, okay. Let me try Carolyn. Carolyn, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Amazing. I'd hesitated to ask this question because I know it's exactly the sort of question that my literature professors in undergrad hated. But I'll start by reading a passage that I really do like on page 265. So it's when he sees Mary and she's wearing this veil, and he discovers that she's a Jane now. But she wouldn't. He pried her mouth open, disregarding a guideline he had never before overstepped. The injunction against violence. It was the end of all understanding. There was no way for understanding to be there anymore, even though he knew violence to be inhuman and futile, and understanding, talking sense to each other for however long it took to bring about accord. All there was that could achieve a lasting result. The father who could never use force on his child, for whom force was the embodiment of moral bankruptcy, pried open her mouth and with his fingers took hold of her tongue. One of her front teeth was missing, one of her beautiful teeth. that proved it wasn't Mary. The years of braces, the retainer, the night brace, all those contraptions to perfect her bite, to save her gums, to beautify her smile. This could not be the same girl. So I really like that passage and just so many sections in The Fall because they're so gripping and visceral, and you see the Swede in denial. But I feel like in that passage, you know, there's also sort of a tinge of resentment because, you know, parenthood is presented as sort of sacrifice as default. And, you know, like parents aren't supposed to count all of the good acts that they've done for their kids. But here he is kind of listing like these are the ballet lessons and all the sessions of therapy and, you know, everything that he's done right for her. And so one of the things that I really love about Roth is that he wrote so much about fatherhood despite not being a father. And I've read, you know, the big biography by Blake Bailey, and I've heard him speak, like I've heard his own assessment of Roth, which is that, you know, he's somebody who can write very insightfully about people, but in real life might not always get people. And I think that's a theme that you've already touched on today. And so my annoying question is, do you think that if he'd had children of his own, you know, his books would have turned out differently?
Oh, that's really a fun question. Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think his imagination coupled with the fact that it's not like he wasn't around children. He had children in his life with whom he was very kind of affectionate and doting and fatherly. Um, I think, honestly, Caroline, if he had children, he wouldn't have written this book.
Yeah.
He had to kind of give up family in order to create these masterpieces, all that time working in his studio. But one, I had never thought about this passage as closely before until you started reading. I was thinking this is as much about fathers and daughters as it is about bodies and embodiment. There's a new, like an up and coming Roth scholar named Josh Lander, who is working on a book called Roth and Embodiment. And he's interested in all of Roth's representations of the human body, mostly with regard to women's bodies. But also he takes up Sabbath theater and men's bodies and the pee and the semen. But when you were reading this, I was thinking, yes, this is a part of that project. The rotting mouth. I mean, all of the repetition, not only of mouth, but rotting and smell and stench and teeth. And for me, this is an extension of his project, trying to show how difficult it is to kind of grapple with, to be close with, to confront a body which is by definition already rotting and aging. So I think that that's another way to read it, as well as this kind of violent imposition, a moment where a father is like physically putting his hands on his daughter. It seems like aggressive to me, which makes me feel very icky. I don't like that sense. But I think that this shows also his interest in ethics in the face of the rotting body as you read it. That didn't answer your question.
Thank you, Carolyn. Okay. Let's try Ira again. No.
Okay, how is that? Yes? Oh, good. Okay, thank you. I'm fascinated by the passage on 35 that you were talking about earlier about getting people wrong, and also the section on page 63 where the character says writing turns you into somebody who's always wrong. The illusion that you may get it right someday is the perversity that draws you on. So I think, and I wonder if you agree, page 63 answers the question, if you're always getting people wrong, why am I still writing? Mm-hmm. Why am I still creating these characters? And if you go back to 35 and look at it carefully, there's a very interesting structure to this section. And it seems to be A, B, and then probably C. So A takes you through the opening and the metaphors of war and weapons and so forth. And B is the point, the turn, almost like a sonnet, And yet, what are we to do about this terribly significant business of other people? And then C, or the synthesis, if you want to speak about it dialectically, is that we know we're alive. That's how we know we're alive. We're wrong. And so in a sense, he's seeking, it's kind of a manifesto. That's why I'm fascinated by this section of writing. And why do you still write knowing that you're going to get people wrong? And he partly answers that on 63. And maybe it's imagination that comes into play here. That's so important. Externally, perhaps you're always going to misunderstand people and their motives. But imaginatively, I can somehow create something that makes sense. And there's a passage somewhere here where he talks about biography. And he says, biography is always wrong. And what happens is you create a myth about a person. But is it accurate? Is it factual? Maybe, and maybe not. But that doesn't matter as much as the generative dimension of biography in trying to understand another person. That's not really a question. I'm curious if you think about it in that way. It's about writing.
It's about writing. So that's like the part C to my answer to Jim earlier about institutions and getting people wrong. This is something we talk about in the classroom as well, particularly with my general education students who are pre-professional engineers, nurses, computer scientists. And we can talk about what do you have in the face of these institutions bearing down on you? What kind of freedom or hope do you have? And for me, for Roth, it is, just as you said, Ira, imagination. It's art. It's the act of writing and kind of and empathizing. And so the significant business of other people, like as you say, it's about how do you write them? How do you become a biographer like Ira Nadel? But also like how do you live with them in the world? How do you live with their rotting mouths and their illnesses and the way their differences from you? So I think that it works at least two levels. One of the levels that is what Caroline's reading pointed up, and then also what you've pointed up with regard to writing with imagination, which I hope, I don't know, I will convince you all that it's literature. It's the imaginative act that will, if not save us, at least, I don't know, make us whole.
Well, I think one of the great things about Roth as a writer is this drive literally to write and to try and get it, whatever it might mean. And if it creates a myth, that's fine. But he recognizes the ability to get, and the character says this, a realistic chronicle is probably not possible, but that's okay. But I never give up the desire to write. That's what I think is so important here. And it's page 55 where you have this little passage about biography turning into mythomania. It's on page 55 in the middle, just after the reference to a fingerprint. And at one point I was I still am very interested in biography and the distinction between a fingerprint and a photograph, and what are the elements of each form, and where does biography fit? I mean, simplistically, is biography a fingerprint or a photograph? And if it's a photograph, that's an image under interpretation. It's never truly just, I shouldn't say just, it's never just a document, or it's not documentary, okay? So we can get into another 2 hours on the question of photography and Philip Roth, or photography and realism. So anyway, just some general thoughts about that.
That's brilliant. Yeah, so just to make sure everyone's on the same page, the middle of 55, Ira is interested in the way the act of writing a biography is compared to, let's see, and since we don't just forget things because they don't matter, but also forget things because they matter too much, because each of us remembers and forgets in a pattern whose labyrinth windings are an identification mark no less distinctive than a fingerprint. It's no wonder that the shards of reality one person will cherish as a biography can seem to someone else who, say, happened to have eaten some 10,000 dinners at the very same kitchen table to be a willful excursion into mythomania. I don't see that's the labyrinth and fingerprint. Where is the other aspect, Ira?
Where on photography?
Yes.
No, I made that up.
Oh, okay.
I completely did.
No,
No, it's something I published a few years ago.
I'm so sorry.
It's a trick. It's a trick.
It's a trick. It's a cool passage too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jim, did you have something to add?
Yeah, well, a lot more listening to everybody else, but of course I was thinking about the description in my life as a man of all of Tarnpool's just boxes of drafts and notes and discarded pages that come to overwhelm him. And I'm glad Ira made the point, about there really is no right or wrong in fiction. Just like there are no tears in baseball, right? No crying in baseball. But and wrong was, Roth was willfully getting wrong the Swede, because the Swede was based on someone from Newark. I'm a friend of his daughter's, and I know the family was both kind of amused and miffed, that they turned this very respectable liquor salesman, who also was a great athlete, a legend at Weequahic, great basketball player, into someone who was much less sympathetic and much more complicated than at least his children thought he was. And I had one more question about getting wrong, and that's, of course, Rita Cohn. Because when I was writing about American Pastoral recently, I didn't know how to talk about Rita Cohn, because either she's really there, of course she's not really there because she's a fictional character in the first place, but is she doubly not really there? And, I think that Deborah Shostak picked up on that question about 20 years ago, but in my mind, it's still unresolved about if you're writing about a character, it's easy to say it's a fictional character, but if you're writing about Zuckerman imagining Swede, imagining or not imagining, but really being with Rita Cohn, it's, one of those, what do the French call that? A mise en abîme, one of those rooms with mirrors everywhere. So is Rita Cohn real? That's your last question. Yes or no?
No.
Okay.
But could I just say, as you were talking, I was thinking about, this is another text that has evolved in our readings over time, and that's Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman. Students are really interested in the representation of the decline of Willy Loman, the way that he imagines things, things that we might read as true memories, but are actually fictionalized. These kind of memories as the sign of a disintegration or the decline of a once successful capitalist. I guess Willie was never all that successful, but this expressionistic aspect, I think Roth is pulling up into American Pastoral. The Swede is always going into some kind of reverie or fantasy with many of these characters. So I think that rereading Death of a Salesman in 2022 helps me understand these fantasy moments in American Pastoral.
I think it's fun to read Death of a Salesman against Uncle Leo Potemkin.
Oh, yeah.
And Goodbye Columbus. That's what always comes to my mind anyway.
Thank you, Jim. So it's 2:00. We're going to start wrapping up. I want to thank Amy so much for hosting this session today, and thank you for all of you for participating. And just want to mention that our next book club meeting will take place on Saturday, November 5th. Our host, Jessie Tisch, will talk about patrimony. And I hope all of you have had the chance to look at our new newsletter, which was mailed out in August. We're working on another one that'll come out in October. And also, please keep checking our website about upcoming programs. We hope that you're already aware that our annual Philip Roth lecture will take place at the New Jersey Performing Arts Center on Friday, November 18th, with Nicole Hannah-Jones in conversation with Jelani Cobb. Registration will begin in October. And the last update I would like to share is that we've spent several months putting together a catalog to accompany the Philip Roth Personal Library. The 72-page catalog includes essays specifically written for us by some of Roth's closest friends and colleagues. For example, Amy wrote a wonderful essay about a special project she worked on in Roth's home. I won't give much of that away, but I will say that the catalog will be available for sale in the next coming weeks, so please do look out for that. Again, thank you all for your support and hope to see you virtually at our next book club on November 5th. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine.